It's great to be here today with Scott and Gabe. And we've been doing this kind of round robin of conversations with Scott and Gabe and Ryan. This is number 3. And as Haris mentioned in one of our talks the other day, we're trying to manifest our conceptual scaffolds to one another so that we can get our ideas out there and help each other to really understand what it is that we're thinking. So to get us started this morning, I wanted to, or this afternoon, I guess it is now, I wanted to share screen and show a little bit of a video that I was watching about agency and design and how this all works together. So let's see what we can do with this.
But a lot of that design logic is fixed. So if you look at the bone structure of an order of birds like ostriches, you have a certain number, certain bone structure, they interconnect in a certain way, there's certain organs. And what happens is that is fixed. At a certain point in the life cycle, that's fixed, it does not change. But this design logic allows certain parameters to change. So if you look at finches, every finch has a beak, which is the same basic structure, but some beaks are thicker, some are thinner, some are longer, some are sharper. So you have parameters in this design logic that are flexible. Like if you're an engineer, you'll design a car, and that car, you know, will have 4 wheels, it'll have an axle, it'll have a steering wheel, but you have variation and you can move the seats up, you can move the seats back. It's sort of the same way. So it's described as an operational gravity well, where the bottom of the well represents the optimal conditions, and that's where it's highly efficient. But what happens is as the environmental conditions change, you have parameters that can adjust to meet the conditions. But they're limited. A finch beak can only become so thick or so thin or so sharp. And what happens, if you go beyond that limit, you get failure and the system collapses. And that's why organisms can go extinct. Now, the variation in parameters is not because of the environment. The environment isn't dictating how an organism can adapt at a large-scale level. The environment determines which parameters or what values are best for that particular environment. But the range of parameters is based on the engineering logic. And what you find is this basic approach is affirmed by the academic literature. And you're seeing lots of literature that affirm this basic logic. And here's a wonderful paper. It's on labrid fishes.
Okay,
and when you read this paper, what they did is they studied the jaws in fish.
Sorry, we're not going to go. We're not going to go into the whole.
Engineering models were developed to analyze
the
mechanics of feeding in labrids.
And of course, I left this thing on.
Levers and linkages that transmits the forces of contracting muscles to the jaws.
I'm still taking notes.
Yeah. Okay. So we're not going to go into the whole paper thing, but I did want to talk about that idea of the basic design logic.
Oh, wow.
So, are we still here?
I'm here.
I'm here.
Okay. So you notice when he was talking about the finches, the difference in the beaks of the finches go all the way from very, very sharp all the way to broad and strong. But that variety is not unlimited. If you get too sharp and fine, that beak is just going to break off. And if you get too strong and stout, maybe it's going to be too heavy and the bird won't be able to carry it around with them or something. So there's a limited range within which things will work. And he said that the limit in the variation is not because of the environment. The environment itself is not causing the limit. The limit is caused by basic design logic. Now, what did you think of that idea?
I like that a lot. And Ryan and I luckily live close, and we've been able to have conversations, and he attends the estuary. So it's right along the line of exactly where the project is heading. Is thinking about, because he one of the points that he made was that bottom of the gravity well being the optimal place, but that as things change, it kind of it moves out, and then you have those limits. And so we were kind of thinking of if you're, I don't want to go too far afield, but we're thinking in terms of AI, and I'd love to know what Scott thinks about this as well, and how you would safeguard all of the concerns that people have for how that thing evolves. So if you're thinking of developing some sort of artificial life form, if you want to go so far as to call it that, like what are the safeguards? Like how would you build in safeguards to manage its evolution in a way that's it's beneficial for us and doesn't go too far off into one direction or another to become something that we don't recognize. And I was thinking in terms of kind of a lowest energy state. So if you think of that gravity well that he pointed out in that video, you have this lowest energy state. So if you develop the architecture around, just like the finches, the architecture around how this thing is designed at the base level, then any sort of adaptation, any sort of selection that goes on is going to be in those certain parameters, and there's going to be a certain cost to making those changes. So as the changes come, it's you could argue that there's an increasing cost of resources to make these changes, but as those resources wane, the system will self-correct into that optimal state. So it's kind of built into the architecture to be able to move out to these edges and then draw back in by nature of, say, if you think in terms of maybe the finch, his beak developed big and robust because there was an abundance of heavy nut trees and he had to really work to get them. Or he developed something very thin and long because there was an abundance of a particular type of flower and he was feeding on that nectar. But then if there was an extended period perhaps of change where there was drought or those plants became unavailable for whatever reason, I would wonder, and I don't know, not being a biologist, but I would wonder if the system would kind of return to a more optimal, or maybe not optimal, but the base level, something that's more general, so that he's able to explore more options, whereas the abundance creates specialization, but the lack kind of brings you back to a more generally effective state, if that makes sense. So like, just you have your
It
maybe
almost sounds like a tennis player, you know? The tennis player is over here hitting this thing and then they're back in their stance. And then they're over here hitting this thing and then they're back in their stance.
Yeah.
And there probably is something like that where there's a balance of to be the point of optimal that allows the optimal flexibility for adaptation so that you're ready to adapt to whatever comes along. But again, that still has to fall within certain design parameters. And where do the design parameters come from? I think that's the big question, right?
Yeah, I don't know if we'll be able to answer that one
No,
tonight.
no. I mean, that I'm just throwing that out for people who like questions. So
Yeah,
Scott,
do
what
that.
did you think about that video?
I said we could try to do that, Karen, but we'll have to come up with what values are. So that'll be easy. Wow, that was you were able to make a lot of connections, Gabe. So that is really interesting, and there was a lot of things that jumped out at me. I was glad Karen said balancing eventually. That was one of the things that also I picked up on, Gabe, from reading all of the information that you sent me. So how do we balance, first of all? And then, but I got really I got caught up on the point at which the speaker said, I don't know if it said his name on there. Karen, who is that speaker?
That's Brian Miller.
Brian Miller. Okay. I got stuck when he said the environment doesn't play a role or something like that.
Oh no, he didn't say the environment doesn't play a role. He said that the variation, the variation limits, or the limits on the variation of the beaks is not caused by the environment.
There we go.
The changes will be caused by the environment. Definitely. There's no question. The environment affects the changes.
Yes.
Okay. But the difference is, here's changes. You can go all the way from a real sturdy beak to a real sharp beak. And the environment will decide which way you move. But
Yes.
the limit that on how sturdy a beak can get and how sharp a beak can get, that limit is not decided by the environment.
Right. And
That
so
limit is decided by basic design logic.
I see. Exactly. Yes. And I understand that appeal, that there's a sort of intrinsic set of laws or properties or optimum or constraints,
Mhm.
that the environment has a sort of completely separate outside role or something like that. And I'm not saying otherwise. I'm just saying that's where I get stuck actually, because I'm not so sure. Um, when there's a very clear distinction between the inside and outside, I get a little bit stuck because I think I'm convinced that there's always some level of gray area in between, not sure, when it comes to a distinct boundary like intrinsic properties of the beak and external forces of the environment. Um, so that's all I can say, is that I went off on my own little uh path of like, wait, he's cutting out the environment like at all, like in any
Oh,
way.
so I mean, I
So
think you might have not heard everything he said then, because you probably turned him off really early when he said that.
that could be.
Because I mean, I can understand why, but he's
So I'm
actually I don't know if you guys have ever seen any of the videos that I've done about Anna DeSoto's work,
no.
because she works a lot on this whole issue of how the inside and the outside, of course, and the thing and the environment. And she shows all these beautiful slides of even what happens like with neuronal cells. So like a neuronal cell can be a very neutral cell, and depending on the medium it's growing in, whether it's in a soft medium or a more striated medium or a harsh medium within the body, that neuronal cell can either become a brain cell or a what do they call the nose the nose cells? I just lost the word. There's a cell for
Olfactory.
all olfactory cells, or it can become a muscle cell. Actually, can become a muscle cell, depending on what it's growing in. And so the medium definitely makes a difference. But I'm guessing very well that it doesn't matter what medium you've got going on there, it's not going to grow into a rod of iron. It's going to grow into something that naturally grows out of a neuron. You got to start with the neuron, and then you've got the external environment. And so the environment can have a lot of impact, but the environment still doesn't have all the answers in it. And that's what he's saying.
Oh, of
Maybe
course.
if I could address what you're saying, Scott. If I understand taking the perspective that things are connected and there is kind of a gray, a meaty area in between the inside and the outside that can not necessarily be as distinct as we might like it to be. But I guess the way I kind of look at it is how is what is the threshold for communication? I guess, are you, when it transitions from being information from the environment, say, and the taking that in and processing it in order to respond, whether through the expression of genes or any sort of particular selection. So I'm curious about how you're thinking about that, because in my mind there is a threshold, and whether or not it's as distinct again as I might like it to be, I still feel like there's a point where the information is outside, and then at some point the information is inside, and it has to be inside because that's where something is done with it. And so it's almost, once it's the inside has taken hold and started to apply that information, what does that look like for you? Like, how do you think about that?
I'm guessing that we probably think about it uh, similarly in many ways. Um, and so one thing I want to say about, I don't know, the way I think about making a distinction between inside and outside, or what is information or not, or what is communication or not, is that it depends on, I guess, like what scale I go to with trying to understand how it works, or if there's a distinction there, or is that distinction useful, or if I sort of zoom in on it, does that distinction become not appropriate? And so I think distinctions and dichotomies and that way of conceptualizing things is very useful. And I think it's probably even the most useful way that we can come up with to like get an understanding of things, is like come up with these concepts that help us understand.
Do you
And
think there's a difference at scale, a difference in the way that the outside and the inside communicate?
I think so,
How
yes.
would you, I mean, how would you differentiate those scales?
I guess you just take as close a look as you can. You can think of things in, well, this is where I feel like there was a great connection with what you sent about Levin and that conversation with Roy Baumeister and Adam, I think,
Adam Omari?
Maury. Yeah. And right, it's the idea that there is no one of anything in the body, right? There's even Levin likes to say, like, Descartes loved to point to the pineal gland as like the one singular thing in the brain, but if he would have looked a little bit closer, he would realize that the one pineal gland like isn't really just one thing, it's many things. And so that sort of multiplicity, fractal patterning and hierarchies that occur, to me, that makes the idea of boundaries really sort of confusing.
So what if we put the boundary on the agent? Because I think those systems you can identify, like it's kind of like you identified the pineal gland and you can identify the brain, and yes there are parts, but you have the individual. So the individual, and again it's a bit of a gray area, but there's still, it seems at certain levels it's almost there again, that idea of threshold. At certain thresholds a certain amount of agency, it seems to, I don't know if emerge is the word, I know a lot of people use that a lot of different ways, but there seems to be agency at different levels. I don't know that I see agency as a scale that kind of moves smoothly across all those areas. I think agency is almost a way of identifying where those levels are going to be most obvious, and so yeah, sorry, I'm thinking it through as I'm saying it.
So,
I'm
Well,
curious,
maybe you guys could help me with something, because I hear, and I have high regard for Michael Levin. I really do. He's got an amazing mind, and he's like polymath, and his ideas are going to eventually help a lot of people. So I have high regard for him. But when he and some of his compatriots start talking about, let's use a human being as an example, or pick an easier organism if you want to, that's made up of many cells. When they start talking about all these different parts, like, yes, there is a pineal gland, but it's made up of all these parts, and so you can't really talk about it as one thing. And then they start talking about how the body itself started out as just one cell, and then then the cells grew, and it's almost as though they have some picture in mind that out there were a bunch of cells that ended up being liver cells that congregated together, and a bunch of lung cells that congregated together, and a bunch of heart cells that congregated together, and then somehow these organs met each other and congregated together, and eventually you end up with something. I mean, when they talk about it, none of them ever get at what actually happened that made all these cells come together into a being that's made up of all these parts. Because yes, we start out as an oocyte, but that oocyte started out as two complete human beings inside of an egg and a sperm that united A one and a one become one, and then you have one. So I just, yes, multiplicity, I get it. I get the inside, the outside, I get the multiplicity, I get the boundaries, I get the permeable edges, I get the whole thing. But how do all these individual cells somehow turn into a body without a uniting principle?
Agreed.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry, I'm
Yeah.
shouting.
that is great. I think I agree. Yeah, what is the uniting principle? And I mean, again, well, it's hard to um again choose which angle we take a look at this stuff from. You know, how deep in the physics and computation can we go? Shall we go? Do we want to talk about right now? And so that's where when I talk with Gabriel, like he has deep connections with the way the fundamental physics is working. Karen,
Mhm.
right? I think you're well aware, and anyone who's seen him talk with a couple of other people maybe got a taste of that. And then, so that is what are you asking, Karen? Like, what level is worth thinking about? Like, how do we frame up all of our different, layers of knowledge that we have about the way our cells are functioning together in an organ, or right?
No,
Like,
I guess what I'm saying is, okay, I don't want to derail the conversation and go off into that because I know you guys have another level you want to talk about, but it is frustrating to me in any conversation when I hear somebody just posit some big idea like that, but they don't give you any path to get there. You're supposed to just imagine that, yes, that's the way it happened. But if you really start thinking about those things and take them all the way down to the beginning and try to imagine how it happened, and even try to imagine how that could have happened evolutionarily, it I've never heard anybody actually get down in the weeds and talk about that. So for now, I'm just putting it out there as a question for anybody. If anybody's watching and they have an answer, put the answer in the comments. For now, I'm just going to think there is a uniting principle that is a level up that somehow makes these things make sense together. But I guess what I was responding to, Scott, was when you were saying for you, the quality of the boundary between the inside and outside is different at different scales. At least that's what I heard you say. And
yeah,
that I don't understand how that would work, because to me, every scale that boundary still has to have areas of permeability and areas of non-permeability.
sure. Oh, I understand what you're saying. I think I understand what you're saying. So, yeah, maybe look, Karen, you're pushing me to my limit here with the talk of boundaries. You know that it's a it's a difficult subject to, like you said, when you think about a boundary down to its deepest level, it really is to me it's perplexing. And we can talk about
Yeah.
boundaries that we think we can see, or boundaries that exist in a sort of mathematical sense, or these thresholds of a gravity well, and um, things like that. So those sort of boundaries and thresholds that we might, I don't know, put some number to, um, that is one way to say here exists a boundary. But again, uh, if you look at something which was a boundary at one scale, this is what I meant, Karen. I think this is where maybe I could have done a better job explaining myself. If I'm at a certain scale and I see something that to me is an effective boundary, that's absolutely fine. But if I go to a different scale, that boundary, which was effective, maybe isn't effective anymore. And so that's kind of what I meant, that the effectiveness of the boundary is tied to the scale that you're looking at.
Okay,
But
that makes that's a lot clearer. Yeah.
we know that other scales and sort of the fuzziness of boundaries is variable
Mm-hmm.
across scales.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
Uh,
I gotcha.
I think kind of bringing it back to the beginning with that gravity well image. I think where I fall when it comes to boundaries, I think though they can be more or less useful in one area or another, I think
Hmm.
there are there's an architecture, it seems like, where those things, you think of the idea of limits, or playing around in my very elementary way with Haris's twin prime stuff, and just really thinking about that. It's like, okay, well, you have these, let's say you have a number line and you have a twin prime in a place. And the way I'm starting to see it, it's like it's almost an anchoring point, because those primes are very solid in terms of breaking down. So you can't, they can't be multiplied or multiplied in divided into anything else. And so it's almost they can, you could look at that in the number line as an anchoring point, and what's going on around that, it can kind of move around it, but if you think of it just in terms of those numbers, so you're multiplying by twos and threes and fives and sevens and other primes to build these numbers that are in that space around it. But at the same time, there's this very solid reality of those twin primes that are linked to one another, so they can't be pulled apart, they can't be moved around, they can't be divided down into anything else. And so I think where we use things like language to start to identify boundaries in a useful way, so that we can say, oh, this boundary, this wall is a city. In this wall there is a city. In this wall there is a cell, a living plant cell, a living animal cell. And we use language to kind of to deliberately identify those things, so that we can start to understand them. But at the same time, I do wonder, if you think in the terms of that number line, something that's much more real, I guess is the word I'm looking for, about the place the boundary falls, the level the boundary falls at. So we find a boundary at the level of the cell because there's some sort of limit there that allows it to form at that scale. We find a boundary at the level of the city because there's something about how stone formed and trees grow and the size of humans that limits the scale of this. And so you would expect a city, as we call it, like based on its boundary, to form at that scale. So there's these little subtle laws that exist in between the different things that come together to make up the unit, that by nature, just that is where the boundary is going to form at that scale. So I see it. And again, you can break it down and recategorize things, but I think just like that twin prime, you will find that closer to those useful limits, the categorizations of boundaries are going to become more useful. And I think you can move into that in between space and start to categorize in betweenness. But I think that is going to be less useful living in the world, practically speaking, than something that lands close to one of those limits. If I'm making sense, but that's a little stream of consciousness there.
No, I thought that was very helpful. Yeah, I thought that was very helpful.
Karen, you were saying, so one thing that I think you started us with, I'm trying to remember back, was the scaffolding, creating a scaffolding of concepts for different people to put things on. And then just recently you were talking about the what is the higher level guiding principle or force or law that gives the sort of oneness to the multiplicity. And so are those like similar things, like these scaffoldings that we create, are those similar to some sort of guiding principle, maybe for, I don't know, like the human experience, or I don't know exactly what we're creating scaffolding for exactly.
Well, I mean, that's a very interesting concept. I don't know that any of us are maybe some of us are creating scaffolding for some purpose or some intention, but I think everybody develops a scaffold just by virtue of being alive. Right? I mean, just by virtue of having experiences, and you have a different library behind you than Gabe does, and then I do behind me. And that means we've all eaten different books. And so they've become a part of who we are, right? And we've all heard different songs, and we have different friends, and we've had different conversations. And so we all have built some kind of a scaffold just by virtue of being alive, which makes communication challenging because I see things through my filter, and you see things through your filter, and you see things through your filter. And the people who are listening have their filter too. And I think part of the value of conversations like this is there is enough space in between these three conversations that people who are listening can find their own place to fit into those spaces. And it also leaves enough unknown that people can be thinking about what are the things that I don't quite understand, and oh, maybe that connects over here to this thing I was thinking about. And so, I mean, I think that's part of the value. So I don't expect that we're going to be finding any answers today, because we're sort of getting to know each other. But getting back to the to what Gabe was saying about boundaries and useful limits and everything, I was thinking about how, let's say at the scale of a cell, or at the scale of a mind, or of a human, the boundary is the, thinking in Jordan Peterson terms, is the edge between the known and the unknown. So all that stuff that's going on inside a cell, we don't understand it because we're on the other side of it. So for us, there's a lot of unknown inside the cell. But for all those things that are inside the cell functioning, they seem to know what they're doing. I mean, I'm using know anthropomorphically, right? But all the things that are inside the cell are doing what they're doing without needing to understand what's outside the cell. They don't need to know what's going on the outside. They just need to understand what's going on the inside. And things seem to function this way. You have an inside and an outside that often the way that they communicate with one another is through an action that some agent, or maybe not agent, but something on the outside takes towards what's on the inside. And those, if you have a watch, the watch is made up of a lot of complicated parts, and it's all doing its thing inside the watch. But I don't need to know that. I just need to know I push this button here and it tells me what time it is, and I push this other button and it tells me how far I've walked today. And so for me, my known part is very clear, very easy, even though I don't know what's going on inside. So the knowing and the unknowing maybe depends on the perspective of which side of the boundary that you're on in any given case. But there seems to be that kind of a relationship between the inside and the outside of things.
No, I like that a lot. The idea of vision, whether it's optical or otherwise, beyond, once you reach a place where you have to penetrate in order to see any further, that seems to be a very good way to define a boundary. So it's like, here's the thing that something is going on, whether it's the person you're talking to, that I have a sense that this person is conscious, and that there are things going on inside their body that are making them work, but I cannot see beyond it. In order to see beyond it, I have to cut them open, or I have to get to know them. Like, so I think that would be a good way to qualify a boundary, is a space you cannot see beyond without some sort of penetration or cutting into. Like, I like that a lot. It's making me think.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
It's got me thinking too. Well, I was wondering about, Karen said like, do you know whether you're on the inside or the outside? You said something like that. Is that was that right at some point? Um, that sort of got me wondering, like, at what scale do you know about the outside at all? Um, so how many different ways are there to sort of understand that there is an outside? Um, and yeah, you mentioned communication as a way to maybe distinguish what's you and what's not you, right? If it seems like something coming in, um, you're not getting your own self in. Um, so that's an interesting thing. There's many different ways that communication, I guess, can occur. Um, you know, you think about cells, and there are some pretty impressive cells too. That's the other thing is I think generally my default to a cell is like sort of a static picture in a biology book or something like that. Whereas some of these single cells are like really unbelievable in their function. And so, yeah, the sort of inside outside nature of something like that is really perplexing, honestly. I don't know if I could go any further than it's just like very perplexing to wonder about those types
Well,
of differences.
I like that you brought up the how do you know whether you're inside or out? Because what I was saying is recognizing a boundary which you are outside of based on your the limits of your vision. But when you are outside, it's like in our case, looking up into the heavens, it seems the boundary to the outside is at the edge of the universe. Like that's where our vision stops. So it's you wonder, and I guess too, thinking of it in the terms of the city again, you have your gates and your windows. So so having those structures, and as you mentioned with communication, there's various types, but they also seem to have a certain avenue. So you think of audio or visual or olfactory, as you said, like they have an avenue. There is a gate designed for that thing to pass through. Um, and so under yeah, just understanding the because those boundaries, it seems like with a building a home or building a city or something on this level of living that we have are much more changeable.
Mhm.
Whereas when you when you go down to the level of the collective that makes us up, or you go out beyond the stars to the level that seems to hold us all in, like those are much less changeable. They seem much more those may be like the limits I was talking about. Those are the twin primes that can't be divided. And though there is variation to them, like there you get to certain levels, like the down to the quantum level, you get to a place where that boundary is more and more robust and inalterable.
Mhm.
So so that the creative organic space seems to sit in the middle, which is exactly how I think about things. When things are in balance, that's the you have the greatest opportunity for creativity, as opposed to when things are at in a state of extremes, that you end up with something along the lines of uniformity. You think the extremes of our universe, you have the black hole where everything is held in place and does not change, and you have the eventual heat death, given the theory of expansion, where in both cases you end up with a uniformity, but it's that central space within those. It's almost like those extremes as well act as a boundary themselves, and it's between those boundaries that life and creativity flourish. So
Great.
I'm trying to think about.
And it's actually even numerically that's what they say. I don't remember the exact definitions, but it's something like the Planck scale is -30 or something like that, and then the edge of the universe is +30, and 10 to
Yeah.
the 30th,
It works out
10 to the
perfectly.
-30th, and we're right smack dab in the middle, like, because I mean, everything that's related to us in terms of scale, the differences are so small. Even me scaled to the earth is still a small difference compared to 10 to the -30th or 10 to the +30th or 10 to the +80th or whatever it happens to be. We're in the middle anyway. So
Right.
I think that's pretty interesting. They always call this the messy middle where all the stuff happens. But
Yes.
I want to just throw this out before I forget it, that boundaries also have to do with identity. And so I want to keep that in the mix while we're thinking about boundaries.
Yeah, very interesting. Just giving us like two ends of the spectrum of, I guess, like depth, right? Or scale, right? The smallest and the largest. Um, and that we meet somewhere right in the middle is just an interesting way to again notice that there's all of these sort of similar yet different stacked up scales of things. It's just it is really amazing. And then the question that I often ask again is like, what is the right scale to make a difference for me or my family or my community or like real stuff? Like where do I look? Or what do I take into account? Or how many, because you can also, just as a person, knowledge of all of the scales gives you the ability to sort of see the relationships between the scales as well, which is totally different than the scales themselves. Um, and so then trying again to take that into account, it's like how much of the cosmos and how much of the molecular do I need to take into account in my daily progress or working through my very human issues or the physical pain or anything that I'm going through. Um, at what scale or what scales do I account for when I'm actually trying to heal in some way or help somebody else heal?
Mhm.
It's an interesting thing to consider. How many scales do I need to take into account? Where do I spend my time? I don't know.
But yeah, I mean, that's a good question in itself as to whether worrying about our conceptual scaffolds is all that important compared to actually functioning in society with all the things that we have to deal with.
When it comes to the more organic boundaries, perhaps you think of being in a relationship, and you have to,
Mm,
between the two of you, work to find where the limits are. And I think there are some limits that you can't cross, so that would identify a hard boundary. But there are many limits that are set in place by the individual, maybe because of past trauma or just personal protection emotionally or just wisdom put in place, but they are movable. Um, so it allows the relationship to form, but also at the same time provides a certain amount of protection. And just to beat the city metaphor to death, it's like the idea of walls and gates. Gates are movable walls essentially, and then you have your hard wall, so you have that balance of protection and communication, inflow and outflow, and you know determining friend from foe and that sort of thing. And so I think whether you think there are limits in place that represent an ideal at one level or another, you by nature set boundaries yourself in order to protect yourself, in order to have a healthy relationship. There is no healthy relationship without healthy boundaries. So I think it's it's difficult. It could be certainly be argued whether or not there are ideal points of balance. Again, back to that Finch drawing, that gravity well being the lowest energy state. So it's the the easiest thing to maintain, and everything else has a certain cost as you push away from it. But like, and the same thing for you. It's like, if your boundaries are, can your boundaries be in the ideal state given a specific situation, and it given us, and will they change in a predictable way as you grow in a direction you would identify as healthy? So as you become more healthy, are your boundaries going to get higher and stronger and thicker, or are they going to get thinner and move in and expose you more to the world as you yourself become more capable in managing the difficulties that come to you and the challenges that surround you? Um, so
I'm sorry, Karen, you could cut this out if you want. I have to just step outside for just a second to
Okay.
check my family out here.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Hold
go
on.
ahead. Well, we'll just keep going here. So, yes, now that's an interesting thought, Gabe. I had never thought about, well, I have thought about it, but the minute I start thinking about it, I always come back to what they always teach you about personal boundaries and how important it is to have personal boundaries. I mean, my own experience was, as I grew as a Christian, long before I ever heard anything about boundary theory or anything in terms of psychology, my own experience was that I depended more and more on letting go of my own walls and my own protections and just putting everything in Christ, because there was this verse in, I think it's Proverbs chapter 18, maybe. The Lord is a strong tower. I run into him and I am safe. And if he will be my strong tower, then I don't need to put up walls to keep people out, right? But there also is this thing about boundary theory in psychology that everybody needs to know what's me and what's not me. Because if I just let anybody in all the way without any division of what's me and not me, I get lost. I just disappear. Now that's something that scales all the way down, because that's something Wolfram talks about when he talks about the individual particles of space. Each one of them has to have a unique identity, because if the particles of space were not uniquely identified, then all of space would collapse, because they would just all collapse onto each other. If they were all the same, there'd only be one. So in order for there to be multiplicity, every single particle has to have a unique identity. And that's the way it is with people. For us not to disappear, each one of us has to have a unique identity. Now, that unique identity can be based on many different things, but everybody has to have a unique identity and some sort of a boundary that differentiates the me from the not me.
Well,
I think,
saying
oh,
what,
sorry.
sorry.
Go ahead.
I just want to say, like, we do lose that identity though, Karen. People do lose their identity. People do have dissociation for for a number of reasons, and we lose even our identity maybe sometimes when we fall asleep, or so there's so many scenarios where that identity that we want to hold to is actually lost or dissociated. But so what happens to where does it go? Where does the other one come from? All of that sort of thing is well, it puts into question that how tightly can we hold to the identity, and yet we have to, right? Like there, as you guys are suggesting, which I totally agree with. And like I often, even before, sorry, I had to step out, I missed, so maybe I'm like way off track here, but even with like the like what is communication, what is information thing, like I I like to go to those levels. Like when I say like what level is meaningful, I'm not throwing out the extremes at all. Because I very much like to go to the fundamental physics level or the quantum level and find meaning in that, and go to the cosmos and find meaning in that. I'm not saying it's just you're right, there's something that it all meets in the middle somehow when we go about our existing. So yeah, what are the things that provide the boundaries or the scaffolding for these functional identities that we exhibit and that we see and that we interact with, and the insides and outsides that are actually meaningful to us that we all know are there, sort of, even though we can sort of rub them out sometimes. Yeah, how do we figure out what those important boundaries are?
I think that's where the dichotomy comes in, because if you think of a one thing, like if space was all the same, it would be a one thing, and it would just, there would be no differentiation. So there, in my particular model, and obviously I made that model thinking it's at the root of something that's true. You have it's the connection, the dichotomy of space and time that would in some way identify the distinct points. So it's how they, because I mentioned before that in my mind the charge is the tension between them that holds space and time together. It's like they're twisting in, they're twisting out, and that identity of, say, a particle that forms is the connection between them two. That is the tension. That is the optimal grip, as Vervaeke would say. That is where the identity comes from. And then as that falls apart, it's because you're drifting into, and not in the sense of extremes as you were mentioning, like the quantum and the astrological, no, astronomical. I always mix those up. But in the sense of extremes of the dichotomy, so you have this state of balance where you can have identity, but if you drift out of that, then you start to favor one side or the other. And it's like if you have space and time, and in some way that they're twisted into one another, and that twisting gives them identity, that unit dissolves when the connection is lost, and you end up kind of in the uniformity of heat death or black hole. You end up losing the identity, as you said, and in order to rediscover it, those dichotomies somehow have to reconnect and interact once more. So you're finding your identity in the tension between the dichotomy, because you can't, again, you can't have an identity with one, like you have to triangulate somehow. There has to be at least two for a thing to take shape. Otherwise it's a space, and there's nothing in that space. It's a volume of time, if you want to call it that. And there's nothing, there is nowhere in time, and there is nothing in space. And it's the coming together where you have something somewhere, if I said that well.
Well, part of the reason I'm not responding immediately is that I'm thinking about this video I have to send you, Gabe, that I was watching today. I just happened upon it by accident. I think, well, the algorithm kind of knows what I'm looking at right now. But coming up soon, I'm going to be having a conversation with a physicist by the name of Delbert Larson, who has come up with what he says is a hard and solid theory about the ether. You guys familiar with the concept of the ether that was popular in the late 1900s and then supposedly disproved by the Michelson-Morley experiment? But then when I was spending all this time with Wolfgang Smith and reading his books, Wolfgang said that there were some ways in which the Michelson-Morley experiment was actually not interpreted correctly from his perspective. So when I read this about this Delbert Larson, I thought, well, I'd like to see if he's onto something. So I've been communicating with him, and he just recently gave me his website so I can start exploring his theory, because he's just now beginning to publish the papers. So it's just right on the edge, this new thing coming out. So I've had this ether thing in my mind. And then the algorithm fed me this video today of another guy who had a theory about ether, and he joined up with a computer engineer to do animation graphics of how this would work and how the electricity would move through the ether. And
Okay.
the picture of how the electricity moves through the ether sounds exactly like what you're talking about, Gabe, when you're talking about the tension between space and time. And so all the time you're talking, I'm thinking, I've got to send that video to Gabe.
I love how over the course of our conversations, because I hesitate to really push the physics model onto people because it gets lost because of how drastic the perspective shift is in order to see what I'm trying to do. So it's really encouraging to hear you're moving into that same space, because, and I'm hoping we'll have the conversation about the physics model, because it is at least from experience trying to share it with others, it's extremely difficult to approach because the perspective shift is so drastic. But I am entirely on board with that concept of ether, because at the base level, I look at space and time as two, you could say, four-dimensional volumes that exist and can occupy the same space, but it's only upon their twisting in via the weak force pathway to form positive and negative charges that you get the interaction between the two. And just the properties, and you see, if you look at my X account, the pinned tweet, we're still calling it that because we don't know what to call it, but at the if you scroll down through that first thread, there's a section that has the properties of space and time, and I see those as the dichotomy out of which these things form. And so I love that you're moving into that same space, because it is really hard for me because it's so visual for me. I see it all. It is really hard.
Have you seen the visuals of the hop vibration?
Yes, I have.
Is it like that?
That definitely tickled my intuition in a very big way. I think the trouble I have, I recognize that the hop vibration represents a projection, so I have a difficult time.
Okay, well, so anyway, it's peripheral, but there is some, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So I get it. And after I've had this conversation with Delbert Larson, if it sounds like there's common ground there, maybe we'll loop him in and you two guys can talk about your physics model, because
that would be awesome. Yeah, I have yet to find someone who has that moment of like, oh, I see what you're doing there.
well, so check him out on X or Twitter or whatever.
When you
still prefer to call it Twitter. His name is Delbert Larson. And if I remember, I'll try to connect the two of you on X.
Awesome.
That's where I ran into him just by accident.
Yeah. Now, if you don't remember, I'll bug you about it, because that's cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, Scott, I know you've looked at my physics diagrams. Have you been able to gather anything in particular, or do they still remain somewhat abstract?
I'd say a little bit of both. I have some context for physics terminology and concepts, but I also just appreciate the pattern and the geometry of it all, and the balance of symmetry and asymmetry and all of these types of things. So because that is where some things sort of intuitively make sense to me. I can't do a good job of describing why that is, but yeah, I was thinking about just all of the diagrams that you have, Gabriel, because you can really, I found myself like looking at them pretty intensely and feeling like I could take a lot away from just looking at the symbol and the different patterns and also the concepts. And so I wonder if you could like tell me a little bit more about how the dichotomies, because I see the dichotomies and the sort of like relationships or maybe scales that can be balanced like a lot throughout the image if people never saw it, I think you showed it on a different channel, right?
We may have touched on it briefly. I don't remember which one it might have been. I think
Well,
Karen had a printout in the first video, so we might. But I think we only touched it in passing because
well, I guess that's up to you if you want to show people. It's on your social media, right?
yeah. But
Okay.
maybe a little context just for now, because the way I the way I think is, as I mentioned, very visual. So the way I explore these things is looking for a shape that has a place for everything. So you see that in the form that I made with the 10 aspects, and you see that in the diagrams that I've made for my model of physics. And I'm looking for a shape, and it's kind of hard to describe, so we'll see if I'm able to articulate it. Yeah, I'm looking for a shape that has the places for all the different aspects, because I'm not throwing out the standard model. I'm not trying to make brand new physics. I'm very respectful and appreciative of all the work that has come before me. So I know that if I'm going to come up with any sort of hypothesis about anything that's true, I have to be able to at least, if not entirely, incorporate these concepts. I have to at least explain why people are seeing the things that they're seeing. So I have to account for that. And so as I'm developing these shapes, I'm making sure through the process of it, I've done my best to gather as much information as I can about what is known. And then what I've done is I've slowly just drawn. I have stacks and stacks of just doodles, and then it'll evolve into equations occasionally, but it's largely just shapes. And so, because it's so hard, one day I'll be able to explain it. But if you think of terms, let's just break it down to a triangle. It's like, okay, there are rules for a triangle, and there are vertices, and there are edges, and there's a space in between. So if you think of the different properties of, you have your electromagnetic field, you have your strong field, you have your weak field, you have those different forces that are present. You have to have a shape that has a connection between those two fields at the appropriate place. So if you think of the two vertices, it's like, okay, you have the electric field and the weak field, and they are connectable via the Steven Weinberg, I think it was, and his compatriots. That's not the word. What's the word of the people you work with on an intellectual basis?
Ali?
Colleagues. There's the one. I had the C right, but they were able to unify the electromagnetic field and the weak field, and so there was a vertices that in the past, during the very early stages of the Big Bang, that this thing joined. And so there is a shape there suddenly. So it's like, oh, I have identified a vertices. So if you take all of the concepts, or as many as you can, I've been able to manage, and you start to shuffle them around and move them around and understand the connections between them, then you can slowly start to develop a shape that fits everything, that identifies all the pathways, identifies all the volumes, identifies all the connections. And so in my mind, as I pursue this thing, and again, you see it in my drawings, I'm trying to develop my visual understanding of how these things are connected in a way that's communicable on 2 or 3 dimensions, because I think we're dealing with higher dimensions. So I hope that I leave at least a little bit able to kind of transfer that to you as far as how my process is, and hopefully that'll give some background with which you can maybe approach anew what it is I'm trying to do, because it's very lonely over here, and I'd like to have some people to talk about it.
Doing best to produce vertices, Gabe.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's I like that. And I think we've talked about that too, Gabe, is like yeah, how do we start conversations around this thing that is trying to be realized, you know? So yeah, what about, because I think even in the beginning of your, I guess you would call it a book, right? Or it's gonna, um, you mentioned that it's about something about this is balancing, maybe balancing the scales or balancing across these dichotomies. And I think that's really good. And then you also mentioned tension, which I'm very interested in a weird sort of way. Karen and I think, Karen, we've talked about tension before as like this is a concept that deserves some more, I don't know, use or something. Um, and I won't go into it here, but I think that I've tried making similar connections as you, Gabe, with the sort of like, how do we go from zero to one thing to two thing to three things, which is a triangle, like how did that sort of happen? Um, and so I make the same connections with like the geometry and then I guess the ontology. And we're not the only ones like that have thought about sort of creating geometric structures or representations of something that, as you said, is like multi-dimensional in in your mind of like you're trying to make all of these layers and connections. Um, and so, yeah, maybe can you give us some of the recognizable boundaries in your image? Give us some of the what's the scaffolding that's meaningful in that image? You said the shape and the physics. I don't know if that how many people that includes. Um, so
Yeah,
what about all the rich dichotomies that you have? I could read off many of the different concepts that you have listed in those geometric areas on the image. And so, how do we make as someone who's just looking at the image that you have so far, how do we make a connection from the way things are laid out to the concepts themselves?
yeah. Let me see if I can share. Uh,
Are you going to are you going to show the image?
We've got your screen. We just don't have anything on your screen. Gabe seems to have frozen.
Oh no. We've had so many interesting little hiccups.
Well, I don't know. Recently, there's been remarkably few technological glitches.
Hmm.
COVID seemed to work out a lot of the glitches in Zoom because they had to get it working so people could use it, across the world. When you work, Scott, do you work from home or do you
I do. I do now. Yes. Yeah. But
speak
I have many meetings
on
over.
Zoom? Do you guys use Zoom or Microsoft
Yeah, we use Zoom
Groups
primarily.
or hmm?
Mhm. Zoom, yes.
Yeah, Zoom. Zoom is way more user friendly, I think, than some of those others.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of different features now too. Yeah, some the I think you have it here, the AI recording. So that's a new interesting aspect to these online meetings is the automatic note taking and summarizing.
Yeah, I always have that going on because it helps when I'm doing the write up for when I publish it on YouTube.
Hmm.
It gives me, so I used to have to spend a couple of hours after every video kind of drafting a summary and figuring out timestamps and all that. And
Yeah.
the AI is not perfect by any means. It's just a rough approximation, but it's enough of a rough approximation for the timestamps that people can kind of get to the region of the video they might want to take a look
For
at.
sure. And I think in some cases it's even better he's sideways again.
Yeah.
Karen, the what you sent about your conversations with Claude, the LLM recently, and I'm sure many other people out there have played around on one of the chat GPT versions. I admit it, I have. Um, and it's very interesting to think about the output that you're receiving, and again, how the input actually dictates, because that is a black box of how your input affects the output. So
This
uh,
is why I think we should all be having conversations with the LLMs. And we should all be having conversations that are filled with grace and filled with, and as weird as this sounds, dignity and respect.
ooh,
I mean,
okay.
it's just an LLM, right? But why not, because we're providing training data, why not
Yeah.
provide training data that's filled with dignity and respect for the entity that is providing these answers, and asking questions that actually help it to delve deeper, rather than accusatory questions like, you got that wrong, fix that. I'm like, oh, well, have you thought about this thing here? And then, of course, it hasn't thought about anything, but by using that language, it goes back and it finds more information and it brings it back. And it just makes the conversation way nicer for me. And I have to feel that in terms of training data, that it's improving the whole mechanism for the future, however it ends up. I mean, I think we should all be doing that as whenever time permits. And
Yeah.
it's just very helpful if you have like the reason I sent you guys that one is that I had been thinking about the connections between Michael Levin and several other thinkers, all of whom I can't bring up at the top of my head right now. And I had the connections pretty well drawn out in my mind, but I didn't want to take the time to write them out. And so I just threw it at the AI and it came back. The first go around wasn't very good, but after I fed it a little bit more training data, it came back with a very nice readout of plausible connections between the ideas of these three people.
Hmm.
So it's quite useful, to use for summarizing.
Mm-hmm. Definitely to use for summarizing. Yeah, it would be interesting to sort of have your own network of trainers on a particular LLM that maybe have a particular, shared set of values or something. And it's like, hey, we have our be nice to our LLM over here with our communal language and understood assumptions and values, and see how that relates to the general LLM, like just takes in everything that everybody is giving. That would be really interesting. It sounds a
Yeah.
little bit actually like a scary outcome to me, um, of some sort of like narrowing of ideas or creativity, because um, as you said, like the boundary of the chaos and the order is where the interesting stuff happens. And So yeah, maybe an LLM, a special LLM with only one trainer, is not gonna have some of the creativity of one that takes into
Well, I would love to recruit a bunch of
yeah.
free research assistants and I could farm out to you my questions, and then my free research assistants and I could all have conversations on the same, what do they call them, an API? Is that what they
Maybe so.
call it? When you take an LLM and you modify it for a particular use. I know Jordan Peterson is working on an LLM that's going to be, the data set that it's going to be receiving is Nietzsche. So it's supposed to be able to give back Nietzsche, and they're working on, I think, the AI video and face and voice and everything of Nietzsche, so that you can actually talk to Nietzsche in conversation. ask Nietzsche questions and Nietzsche will answer out of the input from Nietzsche. Now that's a scary proposition.
Well, it's also wonderfully exciting for teaching history, I think.
Yeah.
So there's certain aspects that are frightening, but also I think there's an enormous value if applied correctly to just reinvigorating youthful interest in historical figures.
Well, I just had, as you said that, Gabe, a thought popped into my head. I thought Shakespeare wrote all these different plays, right? So in one sense, at least one aspect of Shakespeare was the plays that he wrote. So what if you put all of the plays into an LLM and told it to take the voice of the author of all of these and then talk to this Shakespeare and ask this Shakespeare questions about the plays? The LLM has all those connections now amongst all those plays, all the interweaving of all the characters and thoughts and plots, and that would be cool.
So my follow-up question to that is, and I don't mean to be the buzzkill, but my follow-up to that is, how do we know if it's a good Shakespeare?
Oh, you mean that the LLM is making the right
Yeah,
connection?
yeah, we have like this. Oh, if we feed it all of the Shakespeare data, it's gonna spit out the optimal Shakespeare. But like, how do we really know? We don't really have a good.
I'm not saying so much that this new Shakespeare would write another play. I'm saying that, and obviously the only way it would be useful is if there were people working with it that were people who were Shakespeare experts who already knew all the plays and could verify whether or not the kind of training data that it's using and giving back is useful. But I think you could get some really interesting
Yeah,
for
learning.
example, people who have read the Bible over and over and over and over and over again and really studied it deeply, they have internalized in their heads, they have all these connections that run all through the Bible, the undercurrents, the how the prophecies connect up. They understand all these things deeply because they've so deeply internalized the text. And I think it's perfectly possible that an LLM could come up with some new insights into the connections of all Shakespeare's work. I'm just thinking.
Sure. Yeah.
So Gabe, we only have a few minutes left here. So you were gonna share a screen just before we wrap up.
Yeah, honestly, that's a big old rabbit hole, so we can save that for another time.
Okay. Well, yeah, let's look at the physics another time then.
Yeah.
We can do it in a few minutes. Come on, don't you think?
So any closing thoughts, Gabe?
No, I've really just all our conversations as a whole between those on the side with Scott and Ryan, and then each of the opportunities I had to speak with you in concert with others. I've enjoyed how it's progressed. I've enjoyed the process and letting it, because I know coming into it, I was very self-aware of making sure I did not in any way try to push the conversation one direction or another, but to sit back just enough and focus on listening, and then communicating very honestly on the topics that arose rather than pushing topics into the middle, because it is very easy for me to just talk forever about the thing that I'm doing, but I found that that's not useful in helping others understand what I'm doing, because I have to understand their perspectives. I have to understand where y'all are coming from. And even that email you sent me with the video, I put it on in the background at work and I kind of skimmed over it real quick. And the question I asked you in a follow-up email was, I was asking for context from you so that I could kind of start to triangulate the video and get your perspective and how you were looking at it, so it would allow me something to grab onto, because there were many things that were familiar that I had heard listening to it that first time. But once you gave me some context of your particular interest in it, I was able to like grab onto more things and really start to develop the ideas. So I think it's very useful. I like to, and this may be sacrilege in this little corner, I don't always like to listen or read the original text. I like to hear a bunch of different people talk about the text. And for some reason, the way my mind absorbs information, I can immediately build a much broader picture in context of reality, in context of my experience in the world, based on how the writer that is being talked about, or the author, the thinker, has affected all these different people with different perspectives. So I'm able to kind of farm out my reading, which is a bad habit in many ways, but it's been so useful. And these conversations are very, very similar. It opens my mind up and gives me more context and gives me new perspective, which just makes everything more vibrant and colorful and real. So this is just another in the line of progressing towards wherever it is we're going. And I've really enjoyed all of it.
Great. Do
Awesome.
you have any
I feel
final
like-
comments, Scott?
I feel like, well, you got to push your own conversation a little bit more, I think, because, well, or just like feel comfortable doing that, because it seems like there's a number of people that are finding something really interesting about what you're developing. And so sort of anchoring, many different conversations just around, again, a starting point or a really good map, that you have a really like developed structure. So yeah, I think you should push your a little further. Maybe I was fighting you on that today or something. I was steering us astray.
No, it's all right. I think I agree with you absolutely that as it's kind of like developing a friendship, and I'm developing dialogue with you guys in a friendship, a digital friendship as well. And that this as that strengthens, you're able to push a little harder. And so I know that time will come when I can really start to just push these things in, because I know that we trust each other, that I'm not trying to like take advantage of you or manipulate you in some way, that you can trust that when I push something in, it's because I want to share it, and I want it to be understood, not because I want to make disciples.
Well,
So
I agree with Scott. I think you do need to. Here's a caution I would give you, though. I agree with you about how much easier it is and more fun it is to hear all these different perspectives about something than it is to go back to the original material. But after you've gathered all those perspectives, I think it's super important to go back to the original material, make sure it
Absolutely.
hasn't been misrepresented, but also because that way you can take notes that are more easily accessible when you need them, when you come to the place of writing all this stuff down. Because what I've found is I've done all this research, but if I wanted to write a book about it, then I have to say, at minute 1:47:09 on a video that was done 4 years ago by these people on this channel, so and so said X. You can't put that in a book, right? You gotta know what they were basing that on. You have to have read that material well enough that you can internalize the idea so that you can understand what that person was saying and then put it in a book. And that's what I've found has been the weakness of my research, is that I've allowed these videos to colonize my head to the point. So, I mean, that's why now I'm trying to watch a lot less video and go back and read. I've been doing this series, Socrates' Children by Peter Kreeft, where he goes through it's a 4-volume set, and he goes through all the philosophers from time immemorial until now.
Oh.
So I'm just up to the point of Socrates. This whole book goes from the pre-Socratics up to Socrates at the end. and then it goes more modern than that. But it's really helpful to help me slot things into some sort of framework, a conceptual scaffold, if you will, of history, to slot things into the conceptual scaffold of history. And I've been trying to read David Bohm and some of these people whose ideas are somewhat adjacent to mine, so that I have a way of finding language that will express what my perspective is.
Yeah. I mean, if it's helpful to anybody listening or to y'all as well, the way I go about that, and I agree, absolutely, returning to the source text, it has immense value. So my week, it looks like, because of the job I have, I have earbuds in my ears I have the radio, like the Bluetooth in my car. So it's going, 10 hours a day. And so I have my little notepad, and I take notes all week, and I don't think about any of it. I just write it in a way I know I'll remember the reference. And then Saturday morning is my time, because the kids aren't up early and I get up my normal early hour, and I pull out those notes and I go through it, and I find all the source articles, the source text, the people who are expert in it. And so, by that process, I can explore very broadly and then narrow in and figure out what is useful to what it is I'm trying to accomplish. So I reflect your wisdom there. Absolutely. What you're saying is very valuable. So I agree.
Well, and I'm going to burden you with a few more videos, because I found these videos on the ether that I think you both will find very interesting, and I will send those along. And
maybe put them in the show notes as well if you can, because other people listening may be interested in that as well.
yeah, I might hold off on that just until after I've talked to Delbert Larson, because
Okay.
I have a feeling he is really a legitimate physicist, and that his ideas are going to be, even if we don't understand them or agree with them, and even if he's wrong, at least he's coming at it from the standpoint of legitimate physics, where this other thing, I'm not sure what it is. It just showed up on my algorithm. So I'm just sending that along to you guys for thought purposes, but I think I'll wait until after Delbert Larson before I publish these video links to everybody else, because I don't want to mislead people. I mean, I'm just throwing it out there as this is a maybe, but so anyway, really good talking to you guys. And I've had a long day, because I was doing another episode this morning that was also quite a brain drain. So I think I'm done.
Karen, we don't want to be a brain drain. Not what these conversations are about.
I can't help it. You two guys are so sharp and so young and all that. I've got to keep up. Anyway, have a great day. We'll talk to you later.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.